Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 12th meeting. It seems to me that we have a record membership audience tonight, which is wonderful to see. And it's no surprise because it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce a really significant guest to Keele World Affairs in Sir John Soares. We don't need to go through all his biography, except to say that you can see that he's had this significant career forging foreign policy abroad and in the Foreign Office, and it all culminated in his role as a diplomat, ending up at the United Nations. And then, of course, he was called in to do a different job, and those of you who are John le Carré fans may be delighted to welcome a former C. Without further ado, please welcome Sir John Soares.
Thank you, Bill, very much for that warm introduction and for inviting me to take part in this prestigious series of lectures on world affairs. And it's great to be able to visit Britain's first new university of the 20th century, Keele, and to revisit the area here as well. It's an area which has played such a strong and dynamic role in Britain's industrial past. And it's a history that lives on in Keele University's focus on science and innovation. And I suspect that Staffordshire's strong links to brewing has been a factor of some on the university campus as well. But the Potteries has a tough and gritty past, as you all know. And George Orwell visited Hanley and Burslem in the depths of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And saw what he thought was some of the worst housing he'd ever seen in Britain. And also he described, I think memorably, the concrete smokestacks like gigantic burgundy bottles belching their smoke. Thankfully, the area is vastly transformed, as I saw for myself earlier today. I mentioned George Orwell because I thought of him last weekend. I thought of him because in particular, his novel 1984, which I'm sure all of you will have read or dimly remember from reading it many years ago. And the plot, set in a dystopian, oppressive future, is where the main character, Winston Smith, and his girlfriend Julia are drawn into a cadre of people they think are potential dissidents or those who oppose the dominance of the thought police, only to find it's a trap and it was designed to capture people just like them, and they're forced into submitting to the authorities. But it wasn't so much the dreaded thought police I was thinking of. It was more that 1984 was a world, the book that is, was a world divided into three powers, each of them autocratic, which he called East Asia, Eurasia, and Oceania. And what reminded me of Orwell were some thought-provoking essays by the Canadian liberal Michael Ignatieff in the Financial Times and the Ukrainian writer Yaroslav Trofimov in the Wall Street Journal. And both writers saw the world of the coming years as one of three blocks of America, led by Trump, Russia, led by Putin, and China, led by Xi Jinping, which would carve up the world between them into spheres of influence in which each would not interfere with one another. A world remarkably similar to Orwell's Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia, only another 40 years on. The old world order is dead, both Ignatieff and Trofimov seem to be saying, and the new one would echo what Thucydides described the Peloponnesian Wars. The strong would do what they can, and the weak would suffer what they must. We must brace themselves, they were saying, for a period with no legal or institutional world order, just balancing power blocks. Quite a chilling and grim prospect. And this is the week of Donald Trump's second inauguration. And let's just say he wouldn't have been my choice for president. And we're already seeing what an empowered populist leader can do. He's pardoning the January 6 rioters, licensing mob thuggery. He's taken the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement, turning America's back once again on the only agreed framework for governments to collaborate to address one of the biggest challenges of our times. He's withdrawn from the World Health Organization and undermining other UN agencies that do so much to ensure global health, orderly trade, and effective development. The strong doing what they can. Much has been written about Trump's goal to be a peacemaker, but the first foreign policy priorities in his press conference earlier this month were all in the Western Hemisphere: Greenland, Canada, Panama. And it was echoes of the 19th century rather than the 21st century. Was he talking of consolidating US control of Oceania, as in 1984? Was he implying that he's more interested in spheres of influence than in international peace? In reality, it's hard to work out what Trump really thinks. He seems to have a more coherent agenda this time round than in 2017. He likes to have arguments ranging around him. His advisors come and go. In his first term, he had 4 chiefs of staff, 4 national security advisors, 6 communications secretaries. And almost none of these people endorsed Trump for president the second time round, and his vice president, Mike Pence, even ran against him. And this time, Donald Trump has moved quickly to appoint his team. The key quality is loyalty. Most of them probably won't last the full term. But we mustn't make the mistake of underestimating Donald Trump. We have to take him seriously, even when he shocks and astonishes us. And he's not always wrong. I recall his allegation in 2020, early on in the COVID pandemic, that the COVID virus came from the biological lab in the Chinese city of Wuhan, where the virus was first detected. I think most people, I certainly among them, dismissed the idea as a bit of Trump propaganda, Trump sounding off. But it looks now as if Trump's instinct was right. And those who rejected the Wuhan theory as another piece of Trump theater is us who were wrong. And as that wise old geopolitician, Henry Kissinger, observed back in 2018, Donald Trump may be, this is what he said, Donald Trump may be one of those figures in history who appear from time to mark the end of an era and to force us to give up its old pretenses. So what are these old pretenses we have to give up? Well, Trump has no principled commitment to America's treaty allies in NATO or the Pacific. On the contrary, he believes that NATO allies, America's allies, have taken advantage of the United States to secure their defense and prosperity without paying their way. He's going to lead an assertive America, but don't expect serious consultations with allies about what America is going to do, or for America to take account of allies' interests. It's going to be America first. And Trump believes in American power and leadership, but not if that means being the world's policeman. He doesn't like wars, and will do what he can to keep America out of them. Both parties in American politics have turned against free trade, but Trump was ahead of the times, and he argued back in the 1980s that free trade was bad for American industry, as it would lead to industry relocating outside of the US, and that would mean bad news for American workers. He believes in balanced trade, which is contrary to the views of most economists. And on tariffs, well, tariffs have always been a feature of the world trading system. But for Trump, he's elevated the concept of tariffs into his weapon of choice to force other countries to do what America wants. And of course, tariffs don't come free. Ultimately, tariffs are paid for by the end consumer. Higher prices have an inflationary impact, which will come on top of the effect of tax cuts and deporting cheap migrant labor. Rising debt and higher interest rates will follow. There are contradictions in Trump's economic policy, which will take time to work through. But back to Oceania and Trump's goal of more control of the near abroad. Who would have thought we would start discussing Trump's foreign policy by talking about Greenland? And Trump's ambition to control Greenland is, of course, not new to him. It was first voiced by President Truman after the Second World War. The real shock was Trump's refusal to rule out economic coercion or military action to secure, take control of Greenland. But just putting that level of aggression to one side, we are living in a world of great power competition. Greenland is a colony of a small European power, Denmark, which is 1/50th of the size of Greenland itself. There's a growing movement for independence amongst Greenland's 50,000 indigenous population, and the territory is largely funded by Copenhagen and administered by expatriates from Denmark. It has weak institutions, and it's sitting on huge natural resources. We've seen how active Russia and China are in Africa, exploiting weak regimes and grabbing assets. We've seen how China tries to buy up small island countries in the Pacific. A big island nation like Greenland is an even bigger prize. There seems to be three options for Greenland: continuing as a discontented colony of Denmark, becoming a weak independent state, or becoming a dominion of the United States. In today's dangerous world, might it be better for the West as a whole if Greenland was securely locked down into the American orbit and the most geopolitically exposed part of the Arctic were kept out of the reach of the Chinese and Russian hands? And the consent of the population is important. They want independence, they don't want to be Danish, they don't want to be American. But maybe in a world contested between great powers, self-determination by small populations in critical geographies is not the overriding consideration. Trump makes similar arguments over Panama. There's a vital piece of strategic infrastructure in which the Chinese presence is growing. The late Jimmy Carter, in his presidency, gave up US sovereignty over the Panama Canal Zone and transferred it to Panama. Supporting democracy and human rights were a high priority for the United States back then. The same calculus doesn't apply today for President Trump. Don't get me wrong, I'm not in favor of the Trump administration taking coercive action against friends and allies. But we need to understand where Donald Trump is coming from and not ignore the strategic considerations that lie under the bombastic rhetoric. We can see Trump's drift. The Western Hemisphere, Oceania, is America's backyard, and Trump is determined that America is going to consolidate its control over it. So there's no back door through which Russia and China can cause problems. It's a sort of Monroe Doctrine for the 21st century. Of course, Canadians have snapped back at Trump's jibe that they are the 51st state. And I don't take his implied threat seriously. It was more a dig at Justin Trudeau, who has since stood down as Prime Minister. Trudeau was never liked or respected by Trump. But the Western Hemisphere, Oceania, goes beyond just North America, and Latin American countries and the Caribbean will also have a reaction to an attempt by the United States to be the dominant power there. They too are building links with China, some of them with Russia, a lot of them across the Atlantic with Africa. And they will not want to be part of an American dominion. But there are politics involved in this as well. President Milei in Argentina is following through with his chainsaw reforms to the economy, and they're as brutal as their name suggests. And he has important congressional elections this autumn. He's a Trump supporter, and Trump will want him to win. Trump's friend, Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, is itching to get back into the electoral race, into politics in Brazil next year, and Trump will be delighted if he can help him do so. There are leftist leaders in Chile and Colombia who are losing support, and Trump would like to be a player in helping his political allies come forward. And Mexico is being roughed up ahead of a battle to end its role as a transit country for illegal Latin migrants and as a backdoor route for Chinese exports to the United States. And President Trump wants to be a player in all these domains, wielding political influence for his own purposes and, as he sees it, to advance America's power. But Trump's approach to the world rides roughshod over the principles set out in the United Nations Charter: the sovereign equality of states, non-interference in the affairs of other countries, self-determinations of peoples, that human beings have human rights wherever they live. Of course, the United States, as well as Russia and China, have occasionally also ignored these principles. Iraq and Grenada come to mind. But the legal framework and the core principles of the United Nations Charter have survived and remain intact. The UN Charter is important because it underpins the international rules-based order which the Americans set up after World War II. It is only the third system of world order that we've ever experienced, and I believe Margaret Macmillan was here not so recently talking about how war tends to be the norm and eras of peace is the exception. The third system of world order, represented by the UN Charter, followed the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century and the Congress of Vienna early in the 19th century. Each, like the UN Charter, agreed after devastating wars. And in negotiations on the UN Charter between the 51 founding UN members, the Soviet Union argued that the rights of states should take precedence over the rights of individuals. In the end, the Soviet Union and its satellites were outvoted by European powers and the Anglophone countries, backed by 20 countries from Latin America. And the Kremlin went along with the package because the UN Charter gave the Soviet Union a seat at the top table in the Security Council with a veto. But we now have China challenging the international system, echoing what the Soviets were saying 80 years ago. They say, with some validity, that they weren't at the negotiating table in San Francisco in 1945. Chiang Kai-shek was representing China, and India was represented by the British Raj. So it's not as if that's entirely representative. And most member countries of the United Nations today didn't even exist as independent entities back then when the UN was founded. So it's perhaps not surprising that Beijing is concerting with others to try to renegotiate the international system and make it more friendly to autocratic regimes. For European countries, now would be the very worst time to renegotiate the terms of world order. We've some agile defending to do if we're going to protect the system that has maintained global stability for all our lives. An American withdrawal from important UN agencies like the World Health Organization simply gives a free pass to China to expand and extend their role in these agencies rather than strengthening the cause of global health, still less maintaining Western influence and dominance of these institutions. The change that we have now is not that just China is challenging this, and China is developing doctrines designed to appeal to countries of the global south who are angered by what they see as the West double standards, and many of the global south countries sympathize with China's more state-oriented approach. It's not just China in the global south, though. We now have, for the first time, the President of the United States taking what seems to be a similar doctrinal approach to China and Russia. Like Putin and Xi Jinping, Donald Trump seems to believe in states' rights as the building block of the international system. In his eyes, the world consists of big, competing tectonic plates. You've got America, you've got China, you've got Russia, you've got Europe, you've got the Middle East, you've got India. And he sees his role as maneuvering these blocks into deals that serves American interests. And America's allies in Europe and in Asia, and some of those in the Middle East, are to be bullied into line. And individual rights play little part. So Question here, will we see the international system, now underpinned by the UN Charter, in practice replaced by a new Great Powers Compact between the real-life versions of East Asia, Eurasia, and Oceania? I very much hope not, but we shouldn't dismiss the possibility of the world moving in that direction. So what does this new and much rougher system of world order mean for the conflicts on the top of our minds? The first thing to say, perhaps surprisingly, is that not all of it will be bad. Look at the Gaza ceasefire agreement. A deal has been made available since last May, but Prime Minister Netanyahu rejected it, largely because it posed political problems in his coalition. And the Biden administration refused to use the leverage they have over Israel to push the ceasefire of hostages deal through. Of course, Israel is deeply scarred by what happened on the 7th of April. I was listening to some Israelis only yesterday saying how traumatized the whole nation was by the massive failure of their intelligence and defense system on 7 October. And they were saying that whatever space there might have been for an independent Palestinian state living alongside Israel has been seriously set back because the Israeli public will no longer accept or tolerate hostile militias on its borders. But it was Trump's threatening language to both sides, and in particular to the Israelis, that gave the mediators on Gaza the traction they needed to bring the agreement home. And that brought about the release of the first 3 Israeli hostages for many months, and, fingers crossed, at least a temporary halt to the death and destruction in Gaza. There's been a lot of dramatic changes in the Middle East over the last year. We saw the serious degrading of Hezbollah, which is the most sophisticated of the militias in the region. We saw the surprise collapse of the Syrian regime, perhaps the best news of 2024 of all, a brutal regime which collapsed like a house of cards because of some of the consequences of the Hamas attack in 7 October a year earlier, because the support that the Syrian regime had enjoyed from the Russians, being distracted by the Ukraine war, by Hezbollah, seriously degraded by Israel, and Iran licking its wounds and unable to project power beyond its borders. So you're seeing the consequences of 7 October rippling through the region. But the biggest loser of all is Iran. Israel's turned the tables not just on Hamas and Hezbollah, but on the Iranians themselves. It's shown that it has military dominance over Iran, and its recent missile strikes have taken out a lot of the air defense capacity around its most sensitive installations, including the nuclear facilities. So you're seeing a changing of the balance of forces, as a Marxist would say, in the Middle East, very much in Israel's favor, despite the horrors of 7 October, 16 months ago, and against Iran. And Iran is now exposed. Its forward defensive strategy used to be through these militias, which they would arm and equip with sophisticated missiles, train them, to enable them to hold Israel at threat a long way away from Iran itself. But that strategy is now in tatters. So the question facing the Iranians is, what is it going to have to replace it? Are they going to go for what we would see as the ultimate deterrent for them, which we're determined they should not have, which is nuclear weapons? Or are they going to seek a new deal, a new relationship with their neighbors in the region and with the United States and with Europe and with Russia and China, which enables them to escape from the tight grip of sanctions on their economy, but requires them to give up the aspirations to be a revolutionary regime, exporting revolution and keeping itself alive by destabilizing other countries around it. So, will it pursue nuclear weapons, or will it pursue a new deal? I think President Trump wants to be a peacemaker. He's said this many times. He would prefer, I think, in my view, a negotiated deal rather than joining Prime Minister Netanyahu in a combined US-Israeli bombing campaign to destroy Iran's nuclear sites. I'm advised that while Israel could do a lot of damage to the surface around Iran's nuclear facilities, it couldn't penetrate through the tens of meters of rock and concrete in order to get at the nuclear facilities themselves. They would need direct American support to do that, and the Americans would probably have to conduct most of the bombing, and it wouldn't be a one-night operation. It would continue for days and possibly weeks. This is not a prospect that is going to be appealing to the United States, and it doesn't fit with what President Trump wants to present himself as. I would be surprised if the denizens of Oslo would want to give President Trump the Nobel Peace Prize. But the fact that he wants it badly may lean him in the right direction for all our interests. But the Iranians may not help themselves in this. They could well pursue both paths in parallel. Negotiations with America and others in order to get some form of deal, and at the same time pursuing nuclear weapons behind closed doors covertly, and taking what they have at the moment, which is a threshold nuclear capability, into the reality of nuclear weapons, like the North Koreans did in the 1990s. Now, of course, we've seen the power and the capability of intelligence machines, not least the Israeli intelligence, and if the Iranians do pursue both paths at once, that will be exposed at some point. And the Iranians may be too clever by half and tip the argument against Trump's instinct for a negotiated deal and towards Netanyahu's preference for a military operation. We shall see. Ultimately, the decision will be made by the man in the Oval Office. It sounds rather gloomy, so I hope when we come to questions after the break, we'll be able to look at some of the more positive things. But I think it's important to reflect on what President Trump actually means for the world and how we all are going to think about it and respond to it. On Ukraine, again, this is a terrible conflict that's going on. Trump himself called it a ridiculous war, and it's certainly causing huge casualties on both sides, even more for Russia than for Ukraine. By some estimates, Russians have lost 700,000 people killed and wounded. That is an enormous number of people, even for a state the size of Russia. I'm not optimistic of an early deal. We can imagine the terms that might be acceptable to the Ukrainians, just about. A cessation of hostilities along the current front line. A de facto loss of those parts of Ukraine occupied by Russia. They're not going to get them back. You can't regain at the negotiating table territory you've lost on the battlefield, and the Ukrainians know that. But they would want compensating measures to enable Ukraine to have closer ties with Europe, possibly joining the European Union, and to have some form of security assurances, probably the most important issue for them, from the United States and other NATO countries. So there's a package there you could just about envisage for the Ukrainians. But why should Putin sign up for that? As the Republican writer Robert Kagan wrote in the last edition of The Atlantic magazine, Putin's goal has always been the end of an independent Ukraine. And while foreign policy commentators spin theories about what kind of deal Putin might accept, Putin himself has never shown interest in anything short of Ukraine's complete capitulation. But Trump's return to power changes the dynamic. And I think there's an opportunity here to engage in a negotiation which would have been impossible beforehand. Trump has vowed to launch a peace initiative, and he won't want the outcome compared to President Biden's scuttle and run from Afghanistan of 4 years ago. A peace deal obviously won't happen in one day. That was Trump's sort of bombast. But his team are very serious-minded. He's got 2 people working on this. You've got General Keith Kellogg, who's a very level-headed military man, and Mike Waltz, his new national security advisor. They're elbowing out more time. Somewhere between 3 and 6 months is what they're looking at. I suspect it will take most of this coming year. When they come up with a proposal, the response from both Kiev and Moscow is likely to be, yes, we welcome the effort, but we've got a few reservations and a few suggestions. And those suggestions, of course, will be killer amendments designed to, at least on Putin's side, to make the terms of a deal acceptable to Kiev beyond reach. The question will then be, how will Trump react to these Russian demands which change the nature of the US peace initiative proposal? Will he double down on military support for Ukraine, which is what the Robert Kagan article concludes he should do, but would be contrary to almost everything that Trump himself has said over the last 18 months of getting out of the Ukraine quagmire? Or will he make so many concessions to Putin that Ukraine is denied effective sovereignty over its future? None of us knows. We heard in the last 2 days President Trump threaten tax and tariffs and sanctions on Russia if they don't respond positively to his proposals. Well, tax and tariffs won't get you very far because there is no trade between Russia and the United States, and sanctions are only going to have an effect if you are willing to step up the pressure to prevent Russia exporting oil to India and to China, the 2 biggest, and probably Japan as well. Japan you could do. India would be a heavy lift. China would require something very substantial indeed. I don't think any economic measures are going to be sufficient to change Putin's mind. Putin launched this war in order to subjugate Ukraine and prevent it being an effective, independent nation, and he's willing to pay a high economic price to do that. Ukrainians will carry on defending themselves as long as they can, because their very existence is at stake. But the war will only end when Putin accepts that he's got as far as he can, or the price of going further is more than the stability in Russia will bear. Let's hope that Trump can push him in a direction where that happens sooner rather than later. I think Trump sort of understands Putin's approach, but I doubt he understands Zelensky's. In the Michael Ignatieff essay I mentioned in the Financial Times, he writes about the US-Canada relationship, and it says that Americans rarely bother to think about Canada. Canadians, on their part, are always worrying about America and view Americans with a mix of fear and loathing. Well, there's a parallel here with how Ukrainians view Russia. Only Ukrainians have got 100 times more reasons for loathing Russia than Canadians have of loathing America. But it's a parallel that may be lost on both Trump and Putin. All that said, I think Trump's return to power presents an opportunity to end the carnage in the Ukraine war and to limit the risk of it escalating out of control. The war's not going well for Ukraine, and both for their sakes and the interests of wider European security, an end to the war that leaves a rump Ukraine genuinely sovereign and independent would be a step forward. It would be a big price for Ukrainians to accept, but better than the continued carnage which is going on at the moment. Turning to the third of our Orwellian power blocks, East Asia. Taiwan has gone up my worry list. I used to think the Chinese would play a long game and allow the balance of forces to move steadily in their favor. I'm not so sure now. China's going through a difficult period. The strict Leninist approach to Communist Party control that Xi Jinping reimposed has had the effect of weakening China's economy. We saw in the last month a Chinese economist who dared to question the accuracy of Chinese data saying that actually Chinese growth is only half what the official data says it is. He's been drummed out of the brownies. He's been silenced in a very Chinese sort of way. But I think it's evident that the Chinese economy is suffering. Xi Jinping's approach has deterred investment, not just by foreign investors in China, but by Chinese private sector business people as well. He's also succeeded in alienating large parts of China's own population. They have a massive debt burden, huge problems in the property sector, leaving millions of Chinese in the terrible position of having borrowed to pay for a home which isn't built and which they have no prospect of building. Youth unemployment is now so high, the authorities have stopped releasing the statistics. And China's demographics are bad, with an aging population and a low birth rate, despite the reversal of the one-child policy and incentives for women to have children. But most women are not interested in responding to the diktats of the Communist Party. In short, President Xi Jinping may be heading for domestic political trouble. And when oppression at home starts to fail, autocratic leaders often seek an external distraction. And Xi's been consistent in saying he will absorb Taiwan into the mainland in the next 25 years, and he has ordered his armed forces to be ready for conflict with the United States by 2027. I doubt that Xi Jinping had a second Trump term in mind when he set that date of 2027, but it neatly coincides. And Xi will also have been encouraged by the writings of John Bolton, the former national security advisor to Trump, who said when he was pressing President Trump in his first term to increase support for Taiwan, increase their US defense sales to Taiwan, Trump replied by saying, "How can we defend Taiwan? How far is it away from the United States? 7,000 miles. How far away is it from China? 100 miles. How can the US possibly defend Taiwan?" Now, there are answers to that question, but the posture of the US president towards Taiwan, and coupled with his belief that Taiwan has somehow stolen America's semiconductor industry, suggests that trouble at home in China, plus a lack of resolve in Washington, might provide the sort of opportunity that Xi Jinping is looking for. I don't think that means Chinese forces crossing the Taiwan Straits in assault ships. That's a sort of D-Day type vision which appeals to Westerners, but is not very much in the Chinese sort of military approach to things. I think what we might see is China beginning a gradual suffocation of Taiwan, a military-backed customs regime on Taiwan's trade, or delays and obstacles put in place for LNG vessels docking at Taiwan's energy terminals. It would be a sort of boiling frog strategy, with China gradually increasing the pressure to force Taiwan to capitulate while not offering the China hawks in Trump's administration a moment when they can persuasively demand that the president act to defend Taiwan's democracy. And anyway, defending democracy is not Donald Trump's shtick. So what does this all mean for the United Kingdom? Well, the first thing to say is it's a dangerous world out there. We still have influence as a power in the world, but we're no longer a major power. We can't assert our interests on our own. There are only 3 empires in this new world, and we are, rightly, firmly aligned with the American one. But we're not going to enjoy any favors from President Trump, even though he has a soft spot for Britain, through his Scottish mother, for his affection for the royal family. He's not, and we have the advantage that bilateral trade between the United States and the United Kingdom is roughly in balance. If anything, it favors the United States. So the tariffs against the UK, I think, are unlikely. And that affection means I don't think he's going to be abusive towards the UK. In Orwell's 1984, Great Britain was renamed Airstrip 1 by the leaders of Oceania. I don't see that being repeated this time. I think it will be that brutal. But we'll be best positioned to advance our interests if in parallel we are in tune and helping America's advance its interests as well. The core issues are going to be defense and trade. And I believe, Bill, you have George Robertson coming to speak to this group shortly, and he will tell you all about the defense review that he's been leading. I remember George's first defense review in 1998, 1999, when he was defense secretary. He has no one better to do that. But whatever he recommends specifically, as a nation, we've got a huge job to revitalize our armed forces, to gear them up to the challenge of the resurgent Russian threat, and investing in the new technologies that have proven so successful from a military point of view in Ukraine and the Middle East. And I have my doubts as to whether this government will really give defense spending the priority it needs. There aren't too many votes in defense, but it's our national security does demand the revitalization of our forces. On trade, we've separated ourselves from the European Union, and being outside a major trading bloc makes us more vulnerable to pressure, but also allows us to be a bit more agile. I think Peter Mandelson in Washington will be, assuming he gets there, will be able to leverage the fact that A, he knows about trade from his time as the EU Trade Commissioner, and B, we do have this more balanced trade with America than most of our other European counterparts. Maybe the renegotiation of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement in 2026 will provide an opportunity for the UK. So in conclusion, first thing to say is we don't know how Trump's second term is going to work out. He may spend most of his time eating cheeseburgers, watching Fox News, and playing golf. But he will have a much more determined administration behind him this time around, and his thinking is more clearly defined. When Harold Macmillan, Britain's Prime Minister 65 years ago, was asked what was the most difficult thing he had to deal with in Number 10, he famously said, "Events, dear boy, events." And so it may prove for Trump. He won't be allowed to set his own agenda all the time, and he may already be at the peak of his presidential powers with a gradual slide downhill from here on. But one thing we can be sure of, the world has changed. We all know the quote from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci in his prison notebooks in the early 1930s. "The old is dying and the new cannot be born, and in this interregnum a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." And what followed with the rise of fascism and World War II proved Gramsci to be right. Trump is both a factor in the old order dying and a product of deep-seated changes in America. Still the world's indispensable power, and he will take a very different approach to the world from that of Joe Biden, and I think a more considered and determined approach than he did in his rather erratic first term. We will have to wait and see. And we in Britain need to be clear-eyed about our own choices and about our position in this changing world where our relative power is much reduced. I actually prefer another Gramsci quote in which he urged the leaders in politics to show pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And that seems to me to be the right approach for a mid-sized power like Britain to adopt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for all your questions. There should be a microphone. Yes, the microphone is at the back downstairs, and there should be a microphone. Yes, upstairs. Right. So just indicate with your hands. I'll try to keep watching, but let Alex and Zena know that you'd like the microphone. I'm going to start off with a question. There's somebody in the theatre who is not a John le Carré fan and doesn't know who C is. So I wonder if you would just give us a flavour of what that role is and was all about.
Spying is one of the oldest professions in the world. When the British government needed a more structured way of doing it, it created MI6, MI standing for Military Intelligence Branch Number 6. There was MI1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7 and 8 as well. And the first chief of MI6 was a former naval commander called Mansfield Cumming. And in order to preserve the secrecy of the Secret Intelligence Service, as it's formerly known, he used to write his memos in green ink and sign them C, which originally C probably for Cummings, but eventually became C for chief. And so since then, every chief has been known as C, and Gordon Brown and David Cameron, when they were Prime Minister, used to call me C, and I called them Prime Minister. So it's a formal title. Of course, in James Bond, Ian Fleming used the title M for the head of the Secret Service. Of course, M might have come from Mansfield Cumming. We'll never quite know because Ian Fleming never revealed it. But M in Bond is C in real life, and we're still known as C.
I'm now going to move on to the question of your three continents. You've got some minds were racing on that one. The three great 1984 areas that you talked about, and you've put them into a 2025 context. So, Ian Brown, with the concept of the three major powers, where will Europe fit in? Where will we, were we correct in severing ourselves in the UK from Europe? So if you think of that in your geopolitical context, that's not necessarily an economic question, it's probably more a defence question. Jo Sexton just says, what about Europe? So she's wondering where that fits in. Anne-Marie Potter, surprised that you divide the world in three parts, and she wonders where Europe is. So obviously you've got people thinking.
Yeah, well, it's good, and I'm not saying that the modern world will reflect precisely Orwell's 1984, but I think it just shows a direction to which we might be edging. Now, of course, Western Europe has always been, certainly since 1945, has been closely aligned with the United States, and long may that remain the case. But Europe is not a great power in military terms. Europe does not have its own armed forces, and that's quite right. Our armed forces are integrated into NATO, which is an American-led alliance. So if you were to translate the modern world into Orwell speak, then Western Europe would be part of Oceania. And as I mentioned, in 1984, Great Britain was renamed Airstrip 1. Not exactly complimentary, but a symbol of the time. I think we will always find common ground with other democracies, both democracies in Europe, in the Anglophone world, in places like Japan and South Korea, and so on. You ask about Brexit. My views on Brexit are on the record. I never thought it was a good idea. I think we've damaged the strength of Europe, and we've particularly marginalized the United Kingdom in that process. Others will disagree with me, and I don't want to reopen the argument because we're not going to be able to reverse that decision in 2016. But it has made us less prosperous economically and weaker politically. And I think that makes our task in surviving the next 4 years of a Trumpian-led West that much more difficult than it would otherwise be. As I said in my remarks, not being part of a trade bloc makes us more exposed and vulnerable, but it does provide us with a bit of agility. There are silver linings to the Brexit cloud. One of them in particular is on technology. And I think the UK can become quite a force, not in technology like Microsoft or AI, or OpenAI, the big stuff of technology, but in specific sectors where we're not going to be held back by what is frankly over-regulation in the European Union to enable our own technology industry to thrive. And I think that is an opportunity that this government has, which I very much hope this government will take.
quite a few more questions that are about the UK and its sort of influence or its strength. So, Ray Beecham, do you think the UK has any influence left, given its size, economic woes, and its exit from Europe? So he's sort of on the sort of like the negative curve. David Sunny Street wants to put it a different way. How best can the UK project itself in this new world order? So are there some positive ideas that you've got to offer us?
Well, at the time of the global financial crash, 17 years ago, Europe's economy was about the same size as America's economy. Now America has grown steadily, Europe is largely flatlined, and Europe is half the size of the United States economy. And it doesn't have a technology industry to speak of. And Britain has tracked that European side of things. So we are weaker. We still do have some influence. We haven't talked much about the way in which the world works, but as a member of the G7, as a permanent member of the Security Council, as a leading power in NATO, we still do have the capacity to inject ideas, build support for our thinking, and become the center of gravity of some of these organizations and influence and shape the direction in which they go. That's the essence of diplomacy. But power and influence in the world resides from two things, I think. First of all is the strength of your economy, and the second is the hard power you have in your defense forces. And if we look at the two most successful prime ministers, everyone will have their own views about whether they like them or not politically, but I don't think there's any doubting that the two most successful prime ministers of our lifetimes have been Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. And what they had, both of them, was a personality that led people to follow them. They had a willingness to deploy military force, for better or worse, and they were sitting on an economy that was turning around and growing. And that led, in both cases, to a lot of respect from the rest of the world. Our biggest problem now, we have had, again, I won't go into personalities, but we have had our difficulties with our leaders over the last 6 years. And I think our present leaders, and in fact the last government of Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt and David Cameron, was a perfectly able group of individuals, but the party they led had been shot through, really, because of what had happened in the previous 8 years. Equally now, we've got very decent, competent, dedicated, loyal people in government, but the system's not responding. And maybe they're making political mistakes. Maybe they haven't sort of thought enough about what they were going to do in government before they got into government. But unless you can re-engender growth into the British economy and invest in our power of the armed forces and intelligence services so that we are a force to be reckoned with in the world, then I think we will find our influence will languish a bit. There's an opportunity here. As I say, I think there are areas where we can grow, where we can invest, and there'll be a bit of luck involved in this at the moment. The first 6 months of the Starmer government have been a bit disappointing, to be frank. But they've got another 4 years to go before they go back to the electorate. And not for party political reasons, but for national reasons, I very much hope they're successful in getting our growth back up to a level which enables us to invest in all not just the public services, but the national infrastructure and the forces of our defence, which are needed to become, once again, a respected and influential power in the world.
I'm going to ask some more questions about UK defence, but put your hand up if you'd like the microphone. One request on the front row. Anyone upstairs? Okay, let's go on with that. So these are all questions about UK defence capability, expressed in different ways. Liz, Susan and Claudia, in what way should the UK increase its military influence? What do we need? Aircraft carriers? Or they want to know what we need in order to project authority. I think that's what they're trying to say. Sean King, would the defence of the UK be feasible without American support? And David Routs, given the propensity of successive governments to invest adequately in defence, including the Europeans. What real hope is there that defence spending can materially impact this world order? So if we, I guess they're saying think of the major players in Europe, including the UK. If we get our act together, will it make much difference?
Well, the main defence task of the coming decade or two will be the old-fashioned one of territorial defence against a growing Russian threat. Now, I don't want to predict what George Robertson's going to report, still less what he's going to tell you in 6 weeks' time, but he's the right person to answer these questions. But I think he will be looking very carefully at the lessons of the Ukraine war, what has been successful for the Ukrainians in their defense, what has been successful for the Russians in their offense, looking at how the Israelis have turned the tables on the Iranians, and looking at the new technology and the new weapon systems that have been so successful. I don't think the defense of the next 25 years is going to be about tanks and fighter aircraft and aircraft carriers. I think they're going to be about unmanned drones in the air and underwater. The Ukrainians have had remarkable success with submarine drones carrying weapons and attacking Russian shipping. It's going to be about electronic warfare and about disabling your opponent's capabilities and disguising your own capabilities when you deploy them against the enemy. Now, a lot of what the Israelis have done in Gaza and in Lebanon has gone, in my view, too far. They've ignored some of the rules of war, but there's no doubt at all that militarily they've been very effective. And I think we will want to learn the lessons from the Ukrainians and from the Israelis, and I think George Robertson will be, I'm quite sure, doing that. Can we defend the UK without American support? Well, and part of the problem of the last 20 years is that our defence forces were geared mainly to expeditionary warfare in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations. We've got to turn it back into territorial defence, which was the case throughout the Cold War. And during the Cold War, of course, we were completely integrated with NATO, with the North Atlantic Alliance, which the Americans were the leading power. And we played our niche role there, submarine warfare, patrolling the North Atlantic, having aircraft capability, fighter aircraft capability as part of a NATO combined effect. So we're not really geared for doing things on our own. The level of integration and consultation and dialogue and exchange of expertise with the Americans is very high. Politicians talk sometimes rather loosely about the special relationship, but there is something genuinely special about the way in intelligence we work together, the way special forces work together, the way our nuclear communities work together, and are mutually dependent on one another. And so I don't really fear that that alliance is going to fall apart. I am optimistic that the depth of integration, the depth of respect in America for the UK will survive over the next 4 or 5 years. But there's no doubt that Europe as a whole, Britain included, needs to step up its game on defence. The Germans are a classic case in point, how they delegated out their security to the Americans. They depended upon Russia for their energy, and they depended on China for their export markets. And all three of those things have fallen away. And you have to rebuild that starting from the beginning, which is the ability to defend yourself as a nation. And I think we start from a higher starting point than the Germans, much higher. We and the French, and probably Poland as well, are the leading military forces in Europe. But we still need to do more, and we need to adapt from that deployable overseas interventionist approach that we were used to over the last 20 years into something which can defend us and our European allies as well. Because you might think, well, why do you want to defend our European allies? Well, partly it's because of NATO. NATO is the strongest and most successful military alliance the world has ever known. And Europe is our defense in depth. We don't want to be defending Britain from the English Channel. We want to be defending Europe from the plains of Poland and Ukraine so that no conventional force will come forward. Actually, the threats are less likely. We're not going to see the modern version of the Red Army pouring through the Fulda Gap across the German plains. It's going to be about hybrid warfare, about assassinations, about propaganda, about disrupting the undersea cables. This week we've had a sort of Russian spy vessel in the English Channel. It's a way of just needling and undermining the stability of our society, which the Russians will be expert at. And we need to defend that sort of the infrastructure resilience, our intelligence coverage, as well as the hard defense forces that we're talking about.
I'm going to come back to undersea in a moment, unless the next questioner is going to talk about that. So we've got a question on the front row before you.
John, it's nearly 3 years now since Putin invaded Ukraine for the second time under President Biden in the White House. We've now obviously got President Trump. What deal do you think he'll give them? Will it involve joining NATO, and what would Harris have given them had she won?
Well, I tried to address this in my remarks about what the content of the deal will be. I think it will fall short of Ukraine joining NATO, because that's a Russian red line. I think it will be a territorial settlement, which basically gives the Russians the areas they've occupied, which will stick very hard in the throat of the Ukrainians, but they may have to accept that. The real question will be whether Putin can be brought to accept that Ukraine is an independent sovereign nation with its own distinct future. And I think that will be the hardest question to answer. I think the first iteration of the American peace plan will be fairly predictable along the lines that I sketched out. What becomes uncertain is how Trump and the Trump administration react when that is basically challenged and questioned and meets new demands from both sides. Does he lean in the direction of supporting Ukraine, or does he lean in the direction of accommodating Putin?
We've got a question upstairs on the right-hand side, the front.
Hello.
I just wanted to ask how and where Africa fits into all of this.
Well, that's a very good question, because Africa is not only the continent that's most forgotten about this, and you're right to rebuke me implicitly for not mentioning Africa in my remarks. And Africa is going to be important because it's the area of greatest demographic growth. The main increase in workforce, the main increase in productivity is likely to come from Africa over the coming years. Africa is still structurally weak. Its economies are poor. It's going to be a victim of climate change rather than a contributor to mitigating climate change. So it's got many problems coming up ahead. In some parts of Africa, Sudan, we talked about the Middle East and Ukraine. Actually, the worst war in the world at the moment is in Sudan, and it's not getting enough attention. You've got whole stretches of Africa across the Sahel which are struggling to maintain security in the face of extremism. But equally, you've got some very dynamic and exciting parts of Africa. I was at a conference in Casablanca recently, where the Moroccans are very much focusing their attention on Africa. There's a lot of exciting talk about a dynamic entrepreneurial belt stretching all the way from Lagos in Nigeria to Abidjan in the Ivory Coast and across, sort of a mega city of 500 million people along that coast. Is going to be a very exciting place and a place to do business. But Africa does need stronger governmental institutions. It needs to be able to address some of not just the infrastructure problems. I think new technology will help. Certainly, renewable energy has the great advantage that you can produce it in small quantities and consume it where it's produced. So a village in the north of Ghana can have solar panels and use that to provide electricity for a data center or a computer workshop. And so I think there are lots of opportunities for Africa in this, but some of the fundamentals have to be got right. The big advantage they're going to have is they're going to be the source of people in a world where, in most countries of the world, the population is declining.
I'm going to take you to the Middle East, and we've got a couple of questions about Israel, and then we'll move on to Syria and Yemen. So, Chris Nibbs, have we seen the last of Israel's power surge, and is there hope for a two-stage solution, is how he puts it. And Anne wonders, do you think it's reasonable that Israel should displace the Palestinians, is the way in which he chooses to put it?
Well, our position for the last 40 years has been to support a two-state solution in Palestine, a secure Israel, recognized by all its neighbors, alongside a state for the Palestinians. It's looking a long way away at the moment. I think the 7 October event, as I say in my remarks, was a real trauma for the Israeli people. Their defense and intelligence community let them down, and it was the most brutal attack, which has shocked the body politic of Israel. And it's changed attitudes towards tolerating hostile militias on their borders. So I think the space for a Palestinian state to be negotiated in the months ahead is very, very slim indeed. I think you'll need new leadership on both the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side to make that possible. And those leaders will have to address questions which have previously been very difficult, if not impossible, for their publics to accept. So I think it's important to keep the concept of a two-state solution alive. But I think what Israelis are saying is we're never going to allow that to happen to us again, that we are going to put as a priority destroying these hostile militias, even when it leads to the destruction that we've seen in Gaza. Gaza is basically reduced to rubble. It's going to be uninhabitable. And I think the only logical consequence of the current Israeli policies is to force the Palestinian people out of Gaza Strip and West Bank and into the neighboring countries. The Israelis for some time, some years, have said Jordan is Palestine. The state of Jordan is with the Palestinian homeland. The Jordanians, of course, fiercely reject that. And the Egyptians are very reluctant, very strongly opposed, not just reluctant, very strongly opposed to taking the Palestinian population of Gaza into Egypt. The Israelis reply that we've taken all the Jews from the Arab world, and the Arabs can take all the Arabs from Israel. So it's one of those areas which is, in trying to solve this problem, we're starting now from a much more difficult position than was the case before 7 October 2023, and much more difficult than it was 30 years ago. And the high point of hopes for a two-state solution was when the Oslo Accords were being negotiated between the Israelis and the Palestinians in secret, even behind the backs of the Americans, and they got very close. But I'm afraid one of the most successful terrorist attacks or assassinations in history was the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister, by a Zionist extremist in Jerusalem. That setback, it destroyed confidence in the Oslo Accords, and we've never reached the same opportunity to have peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I think it's interesting how attitudes in the Arab world is changing. We've seen peace between Israel and Egypt 50 years ago almost, peace between Israel and Jordan 30 years ago. We're seeing the Abraham Accords, where a number of Arab countries have recognized Israel as part of a wider business and tourism agreement, not just as a political agreement. But the big one is Saudi Arabia, of course, for Israel. That might be possible. The Saudis are very, very clear they're not interested in this unless there is some progress towards a Palestinian state. So it's not looking great at all for a longer-term peace. You've got an Israel bristling as a sort of new Sparta in the region, and not prepared to accept and tolerate what it has done for the last 30 years of Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Israel. But equally, you can damage and kill individuals and destroy their military capability. You can't kill an idea. And that is the problem that the Israelis have not yet confronted, is how you address the idea of Palestinian nationhood, Palestinian identity, and the divisions in Lebanon on their northern border. I don't think a long-term solution for Israel lies in being surrounded by chaos. It needs to be surrounded by stable states who can govern themselves and hold to agreements, which is what they've done with Egypt and Jordan. We'll see what Syria holds for the decades ahead. I'm optimistic that what comes out in Syria is better than the Assad regime. Few things could be worse than the brutality of the Assad regime. But the core question at the heart of the Middle East remains unanswered.
I'll take your question in a moment. I just would like, John, to ask you, because that's Jenny Hartley's question, what do you think is the best thing which the UK, the EU and the USA can do to ensure that the new Syria develops as a, they put it, she puts it, free, democratic and prosperous state? Can you see any hope for that?
The first thing we should do is get out of the way. And we're in the way at the moment because we've still got sanctions against Syria, designed as sanctions against the Assad regime, but still being applied against the new authorities. We have, for reasons which were valid 10 years ago, designated this militia that's taken over Syria, HTS, as a terrorist organization. And it was 10 years ago. It was part of Al-Qaeda. But for the last few years, it's been tackling and overcoming Al-Qaeda groups that have been operating in Syria. And they've been operating like a national liberation movement and not like a terrorist organization. So I think we need to get rid of the constraints on contacts with the Syrians and trade with the Syrians. And we need to help them bring together a representative group of Syrians to develop, to design and negotiate and implement a new constitution for the country. I think it's easier to cause difficulties in a place like Syria after this than it is to build a constructive future. But other countries have shown how you can do it. Poland, after the collapse of communism in 1989, produced this amazing round table of respected figures from civil society, from the trade unions, from business, from the professions, that hammered out a new constitution. Even in Iraq, and Iraq gets a bad chit these days because of the controversy around the invasion back in 2003. But even after that, we pulled together a representative council of Iraqis that moved that forward. We weren't at all helped by the Syrians, amongst others, Syrians and the Iranians, trying to undermine Iraq. But I saw the Iraqi Prime Minister in London last week, and they've done a remarkable job of stabilizing that government. And he said that he's the first Iraqi Prime Minister for 20 years whose biggest problem is investment and regenerating the economy rather than providing for the basic security of the country. And they've done that by reaching out across the community divides, across religions, across ethnicities, finding deals with the Kurds. And we need to do something similar in Syria.
We've got a question. We've got a question upstairs on the right-hand side.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
China.
Yeah.
China GDP is significantly better than ours, and it has been considerably better, but has been, let's say, a little bit more fraught in recent time, but it's still something like 5-6% compared to our very modest GDP. Do you think that China will continue to grow economically, but also from a military point of view? Will that also have significant influence on the rest of the world?
Well, as I said in my remarks, I think China is entering a difficult period for China. It's pretty clear that their claims of growing at 5 or 6% are not true. We don't know exactly what their growth rate is, but you could probably divide it by half to get a realistic figure. That's according to Chinese economists, I'm not an economist myself. I think they're running into social problems. I think they're running into resistance to the Leninist style of rule that Xi Jinping has introduced. So I think China as a state faces all the contradictions that countries with no checks and balances face. Deng Xiaoping, when he was leader after Mao, was determined not to allow a repeat of the mistakes of the Mao era, so introduced term limits and age limits for people. They forced them to rotate the leadership every 10 years. Xi Jinping very unwisely has set that aside. He's both reconcentrated power in himself and picked fights with the West and with America when China is not really ready for it. So yes, their economy is still growing, maybe 2 or 3% rather than 5 or 6%, but the fundamentals of the society are not really in place to make China lead to China overtaking the United States as the major power in the world. Of course, their GDP is bigger than ours. They have a very dynamic technology sector. We shouldn't ignore that. And technology is going to be the main area of competition between China and the rest of the world. But I don't think we should compare ourselves with China. The big dog fight will be between China and the United States. And we are going to be alongside countries like France, Japan, Turkey, maybe India, although India will aspire to go to the top league as well, trying to maintain a world that is safe for small and medium-sized countries and not dominated by power struggles between the great powers. And I think that is why the world order set out in the UN Charter is so important for us to maintain if we possibly can.
3 questions in quick succession about Russia. They're all different, but if you wouldn't mind sort of quickly expressing a view. So Christine Powis, how much do you think Trump's wish to produce more oil, thus lowering the cost of a barrel, could influence Russia and other countries as a sort of bargaining chip? Sean King, how secure is Putin's hold over Russia? May or may not be related to the economic factors. And then we've got Terry O'Neill's question, and he's rather different. It's become increasingly obvious that Russia is only a great power through the use or the threat of use of nuclear weapons. So he wonders, in a changing world order and norms, will this encourage nuclear proliferation? We can go through those again.
No, I've got them. I'm thinking how to reply to them. I think on the question of Putin's hold over Russia, there's no doubt he's got a tight grip. We saw what happened to Prigozhin, the commander of the Wagner battalions, when he challenged Putin. He died in a mysterious plane accident. We saw what happened to Alexei Navalny, completely cynically murdered in prison, and all his supporters arrested and harassed on the streets. And you're not even seeing protests yet by the mothers and sisters and wives of the bereaved in the Ukraine war, of which there are 700,000 families directly affected by the dead and injured in Ukraine. So he's got a tight grip. But as we saw with the Assad regime a month ago, you can have a tight grip and it all falls away very quickly. Now, I don't think Russia is anything like the fragility of the Assad regime, so don't get me wrong. It's in a regime where the system it doesn't have any ideology, really. It's not a communist country. That was sort of rejected 30 years ago. But what that means is there aren't really any institutions in Russia. Yes, they've got an effective central bank. Yes, they've got some successful oil companies. But if Putin suddenly fell ill, they don't even have a mechanism for agreeing a successor. In that way, at least China and Iran have got those mechanisms in place as to how you go about it. So Putin's control of Russia is pretty thorough. But as with all autocracies, it's thorough until it's not. Like Scott Fitzgerald's character who went bankrupt and was asked why he went how he went bankrupt, he said, first gradually and then suddenly. And that's how autocracies fall. So oil and Trump, I think Trump does see a trade-off between tighter sanctions on Russian oil and greater production in the United States of oil and gas. And he might be right. As I was saying in my remarks, I think if he wants sanctions, he wants to really curb Russian oil sales. He can't do it at the cost of sending the price of oil through the roof. So he's got to produce more capacity, and he's got to be able to ensure that those countries that currently receive Russian oil have some alternative source of supply. It's not impossible. I think it's exaggerated. And as I said in my remarks, I think the only real measure that Trump will be able to take that will have Putin deeply concerned would be a reinvigoration of American military support for Ukraine rather than the gradual tailing off of that support. And I don't think that looks very likely at the moment. And the third question was about nuclear. I think we are at a difficult time. I mean, most of us in this audience are young enough to remember the Cold War. I can't actually remember myself the 1962 nuclear crisis over Cuba. Some of you may remember it. I do remember, although none of us knew it at the time, but I do remember 1983, which was probably the most dangerous moment in the Cold War, when the Russians were convinced that America and NATO were going to invade Russia, and they had their finger literally hovering over the nuclear button for a whole weekend without us knowing about it, because of an exercise which they had misinterpreted. So we know what uncertainty of a large-scale nuclear threat feels like. The threat at the moment, I don't think, I've said a lot of worrying things perhaps over the course of the last 2 hours, but I don't actually think we are close to nuclear conflict. I think
the idea is proliferation.
Yeah,
other countries trying to copy.
Well, we're seeing that at the moment with Iran. Iran is probably the country closest to the nuclear threshold. And if that happens, if the Iranians do cross the nuclear threshold, well, the Saudis and the Turks and others will want to do so as well to provide a balance in the region. It is remarkable that the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1969 has held for the last 55, 56 years. And the 5 nuclear powers, yes, have expanded to 9 nuclear powers because India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea have all become nuclear weapon states. Israel not acknowledged, but of course is. But back in the 1960s, the expectations were that there'd be 30, 40, 50 nuclear weapon states, and that nuclear weapons would be very hard to contain. There's another reason why the international order that has been painstakingly built since 1945 is really in our interest to keep in place, and why I think it is really important for us in Europe that the Iranians do not acquire actual nuclear weapons, because it would be a really serious destabilizing impact in the region. I very much hope that they can be persuaded to enter a deal to prevent that happening. That would be by far the best way of doing so.
We've got a question upstairs.
You mentioned the fact that the Indians and the Japanese are helping to circumvent the Russian oil embargoes and problems. Why doesn't the democratic countries around the world do something about it to prevent Japan and India doing it?
Well, a lot of this goes back to the Biden administration, who introduced constraints on the Russian oil exports, but for political reasons back home, didn't want the price of oil to go up too high because they thought it would damage their prospects at the election last November. In fact, a lot of good it did them, frankly. But the stabilizing the international energy prices is not a bad thing to try to do. And of course, if you've got long-term arrangements with suppliers of oil and gas, it's a fundamental question of your own economic stability. But I think more could have been done, there's no doubt about it, to cut that back. And as one of the last acts of the Biden administration was to take sanctions against Russia's oil fleet, the so-called shadow fleet, which is exporting oil and gas, LNG, to some of these markets. And that's something which the Trump administration now has as a card it can play in the negotiations with the Russians. But this is going to be it's going to be a complex challenge because it's multidimensional. It's about the energy supplies for important allies of ours, like Japan and India. We're getting good deals from all this, but it is all obviously helping Russia acquire the funds necessary to prosecute its war.
Got a variety of questions about undersea damage. I just wonder if you've got any brief comments about the threats from China, Russia, or any other parties to the Western world.
I think the problem here is Russia. They have clearly identified undersea infrastructure, whether it's gas pipelines or internet cables, communications cables, as a vulnerability which we are very badly placed to cover. The best insurance you have is a diversity of communication arrangements. That's relatively easy with telecommunications and the internet. When a Russian ship dragged its anchor between Estonia and Finland, it took out some important cables, but they could be replaced by redirecting the traffic through Sweden or elsewhere in order to compensate. But obviously, if this happens more widely, and if it happens against energy infrastructure, then it is more serious. There's vital gas pipelines between Norway and Europe, and between Norway and Britain. There are electricity submarine cables. If they were severed, well, we would feel the impact very quickly indeed. So this is one of the areas which George Robertson's Defence Review is going to have to address. We had sort of blithely assumed that if you lay a cable along the bottom of the seabed, you could forget about it. And I think what we now realise is that our infrastructure is crucial to our stability and coherence as a society, and we have to protect that critical infrastructure, whether it's our banking system or our communication system or our railway system or whatever it is, the physical side of it, but you've also got to think about the invisible parts of it that are either virtual, i.e. digital, or out of sight underwater, and that's going to be a big challenge for the years ahead.
A couple of questions about aging leaders, and then, sorry, we've got two questions to finish off with. And so, old leaders, Julie, the three key players are all in their golden years. So the question is, what would happen if one or more of them became incapacitated in any way? We obviously know there's a United States alternative, a younger one. Comment briefly on Xi and perhaps again on Putin.
I think it's a sad reflection that the average age of the candidates at the last presidential election in the US looked as though for a long time it was going to be 80 years old until Biden was prevailed upon to withdraw. Being a leader of a country is incredibly demanding physically and emotionally, and that's why I think people in their 40s and 50s are better placed to be national leaders than people in their 70s and 80s. But whatever happens to leaders, you have to have a mechanism to replace them. We're seeing, at the moment in Canada, the Prime Minister resigned. How is the Canadian Liberal Party going to choose a new leader ahead of the elections, which will fall due sometime in the spring? Well, they have mechanisms to do that, like our political parties here have mechanisms. Sometimes they take too long. China is actually quite well placed on this, because China does have a ruling group of which the president is primus inter pares, first among equals. And if Xi Jinping fell under a bus, got a heart attack, or was assassinated, then the Chinese system would be able to come together and produce a new leader with lots of faction fighting going on behind the scenes, but they have a system to do it. The most dangerous one is Russia, because the Russians, some of us will remember the early 1980s when Brezhnev died, and then Andropov died, and then Chernenko died, and there was a sort of series of funerals in Moscow. But the Russians had, the Soviets had the Politburo, which was a structure where a new leader would emerge and the system would follow behind it. There's no such thing in Putin's Russia. So quite what would happen if Putin died, we simply don't know.
2 questions. Next one. Women often comes up in meetings at Keele World Affairs. Jan Ferguson. Always a minority of women in the power structures. What difference do you think we'd gain in geopolitics if more women's voices were heard?
I take this as an important question because I think the biggest change in the lifetimes of all of us in this room has been the role of women in society. I'm old enough whereby it was expected that the man would be the dominant breadwinner, would play a sort of traditional male role, and the women would play a supportive role. When I look at my kids' generation, they're all in their 30s now, it's completely different, utterly transformed, and there's almost complete equality between the careers of the man and the woman. And in organizations, like even traditional organizations like MI6, the role of women is completely transformed from how it was before. And I'm a firm believer in diversity. I think diversity brings better results. And that's not just diversity between genders, it's diversity between backgrounds, diversity of thought, diversity of experience. If you have a monochrome group, whatever it's made up of, you're only going to get one set of experiences coming into the decision-making pool. If you have several people of different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different gender, then you get a much better quality decision-making. And I think we're learning not to caricature men's roles and women's roles.
But maybe Jan was thinking about national level. I mean, we've got a Maloney.
Yeah.
We haven't got a Margaret Thatcher. We haven't got a Liz Truss either. Are there any? Do you see women at that level having much impact in the near future?
Well, I do. I think politics is a very rough game. In the same way that you don't get so many women as traders in city banks because it's cut and thrust and it doesn't necessarily suit women's temperament or the sort of work-life balance that they want to have. Again, I hesitate to sort of caricature these things, but I think you've seen successful women leaders in Israel, in India, in Britain, in Italy at the moment, in Germany. You've not had a woman leader in the United States or in Russia or in Japan. So different societies manage these things differently. I don't think Giorgia Meloni has got a soft, warm approach, whereas President Macron in France is sort of a tough, testosterone-charged male. Their politics are almost the other way around. But I do think that diversity in any group, including at the top level, adds to the quality of decision-making. So you can't have quotas on these things. But we've actually had 3 women prime ministers in this country. One of them was very successful, one of them was not very successful, and the third was a total disaster. It's not as if women in the top role actually cures the problem, but equally, I think having women in leadership groups makes it more collegial, can make it a more balanced and more open discussion than it would otherwise be.
Can we switch, finally, from gender to youth? Forgive me, because there are lots of questions you've all submitted that we aren't able to cover tonight. But Zena and Alex will have the last word. Everyone knows them. So, as they say, as ambitious young people who are hoping to make a positive effect on the world, they wonder where a young John Sawers would want to be. Which rooms would you want to be in?
Yeah.
What would you want to be doing?
Well, one thing I say, I went to university 50 miles downriver from here at Nottingham, and I was did a degree there over 3 years, and then I ran the Students' Union for a year, which gave me a feel for politics, for representation, for negotiation with the university authorities, which was quite an experience for me. But also, university life is fairly protected and closed. I think it's really important that young people have experienced a bit of toughness in the world. And if you want to make an impact, you've got to push yourself a bit harder. And that means putting yourself in difficult places, doing volunteer jobs in emerging market countries, developing countries, or working in tough communities in our own country, to see how a different part of the community live, different from what your background is. And I think there's a great opportunity for people between university and their mid-20s, because it's a time when you can really experience some of the more demanding side of life by traveling, by doing difficult jobs in difficult places. And I think the best quality people that come into public service, whether it's in diplomacy or intelligence or the armed forces, have got a bit of experience of the world behind them. So I don't think you should go off and join a think tank.
But here's a quick question. Starting over again, would you want to be a diplomat?
I would, actually. I was very lucky, I have to say, that I began my diplomatic career at the start of Margaret Thatcher's prime ministership, and I finished it whilst David Cameron was Prime Minister. And during those sort of 35 years, Britain played a significant part in the world, even though our relative power was gradually declining. I think that was really helpful. I think public service is one of the most rewarding things that you can do. I finished my public service career much less wealthy than my counterparts who went into law or accountancy or business, but I ended up much more satisfied because I felt every day I was doing something which was a benefit not to me, but to a wider good to the country and so on. Now, I don't want to be arrogant about this, but I think that motivation of what you do each day is really important. And there are lots of ways of being a public servant. You can be you can work as a doctor or a support person in the NHS. You can work as a community figure. You can work as a political representative, or you can be in the armed forces or the intelligence services. But that notion of public service, I think, is really important. And in order to get there, I think it's important that you have some experience outside your previous existence, so you discover more about yourself and you develop some resilience for dealing with the tough things in life. Because life is tough. Work is stressful. And the people who can manage that in their late 20s are usually the ones who've had a diversity of experience in their early 20s.
Well, Zeno and Alex, and anyone else who is starting out, you have your answer. All the best with that. Wise words. We've had many wise words this evening from Sir John Soares. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Well done.